Horsepower, mate, that's the heart and soul of any beast on wheels. It's not just a number, it's the raw, pulsating force that turns tires into smoke and tarmac into a blur. It's not just a speck on a sheet, it's the lifeblood of the car enthusiast, the measure of a car's spirit, the difference between getting there and arriving with style. It's what makes a motorhead's heart race faster than any car they've ever driven. Well, strap in, because this tale's got more kick than a nitro boost. Back in the day when men were men and engines were just a twinkle in a blacksmith's eye, we had these things called horses. Yeah, those four-legged, naysaying, apple-munching creatures. Now, James Watt, not the kind you plug into, but the bloke who tinkered with steam engines, he had a problem. He needed a way to tell all those coal-shoveling, factory-owning bigwigs how much work his newfangled steam engine could do compared to their trusty horses. So, what does Watt do? He watches these horses, probably while sipping on something strong, and figures out that one horse can lift 33,000 pounds, 1 foot in 1 minute. He calls this 1 horsepower. Why? Because it's easier to sell an engine that does the work of 10 horses than to explain the intricacies of mechanical advantage to a guy who's still impressed by the wheel. Now, when the combustion engine rolled onto the scene, looking all tough with its explosions and smoke, it needed to flex its muscles. So, what better way to show off than to say, hey, this iron beast here, it's got the power of 200 horses. Never mind that these horses are metaphorical, trapped in the confines of pistons and cylinders, working their tails off without a single carrot in sight. The essence. Horsepower is the measure of an engine's muscle, its ability to do work over time. Think of it like this. 1 horsepower is the power needed to lift 550 pounds 1 foot off the ground in 1 second. But in our world, it's how fast you can get from 0 to, oh, hell yeah! The math. If you're into the numbers, horsepower can also be calculated with torque and RPM. The formula goes like this. Horsepower equals torque times RPM divided by 5,252. That's where you see how revs and twisting force translate into raw power. The feeling. When you're behind the wheel, horsepower is that kick in the back when you floor it. It's the roar that comes from the exhaust, the force that pins you to your seat, and the grin that spreads across your face. It's not just speed, it's the sensation of speed, the thrill of acceleration. The drive. On the road or track, horsepower dictates how you drive. With more power, you're not just driving, you're commanding. You've got the thrust to overtake, the pull to climb hills like they're flat, and the power to drift corners with smoke pouring off the tires. But all that power didn't happen overnight. Imagine that first dinner conversation telling the missus you wanted to trade the old mare in for a set of wheels. Think about it. The first motorheads were born. You're in a world where the horse isn't just transportation, it's a buddy, a worker, and a status symbol all rolled into one. But now here comes this mechanical beast, all gears and grease, promising to get you from A to B without leaving a, let's say, natural trail behind. It's the late 1800s, a time when the air was thick with the smell of hay and the clippity-clop of hooves. But then along comes this contraption, a real game changer, the automobile. Selection. Instead of choosing between a chestnut mare or a black stallion, you're now ogling at something with wheels and an engine. The first cars, like the Benz patent motor wagon with 0.75 horsepower, were more like motorized carriages. You'd be looking at something that might cost you around 600 German marks in 1886, which was no chump change. The sales pitch, the ads, oh, they were something else. They'd pitch these cars as the future. No need for oats, just gasoline. Winton's ad in 1898 was all about dispensing with a horse, offering speeds that would make even the fastest thoroughbred blush, up to 20 miles per hour. Initially, folks were about as welcoming to cars as a cat to a bath. They threw rocks, scoffed at the noise, and missed the familiar neighs. Cars were seen as a rich man's novelty, a fad, as one banker told Henry Ford's lawyer. The experience, driving one of these early machines, it was an adventure. No power steering, no climate control, just you, the open road, often just a dirt track, and the elements. But the freedom, the speed, It was like going from sail to steam in the world of personal transport. Cultural shift. Choosing a car was like opting for a smartphone when everyone else is using a landline. It was progressive, a bit rebellious, and definitely forward-thinking. You'd be part of a shift from living, breathing horsepower to the mechanical kind. Over time, as the 19th turned into the 20th century, the Ford Model T, with around 20 horsepower, became the common man's chariot. The cost and maintenance of a car versus a horse started making more economic sense. Cars didn't need feeding when not in use, and they could cover distances in a fraction of the time without tiring. Now, even though those early rides lacked horsepower, they still kicked ass better than Mrs. Jones' donkey. Those first cars lacked aerodynamics, tires, turbochargers, but also heavy airbags, chunky infotainment systems, and often less steel. Those old cars were lightweights compared to today's rides. Their lower weight needed less power needed to move them. A car that tips the scales less can dance around with fewer horses pulling it. With limited horsepower, they use gear ratios set up for acceleration over top speed. They might not have had the high-end speed of modern cars, but they could get off the line quick with those short gears. It's all about how you use the power you've got. Those narrow tires offered less grip. Less grip means less resistance. So even with lower horsepower, these cars could still spin the tires and feel lively. Engines were tuned differently. They might not have had the peak numbers, but they had a broader power band. You didn't need to wring out every last RPM to feel the power. It was there, chunky and usable, right in the mid-range where you could enjoy it. Old cars often focused on torque, that low-end grunt that gets you moving. Horsepower might get you to high speeds, but torque is what you feel when you punch it from a standstill. Every bit of power the engine made went more directly to turning the wheels. No power steering, no AC, no electronic nannies sapping the juice. Driving those cars was raw. You felt every horsepower because you were more connected to the car. There was no insulation from the road or the engine's roar. Every bump, every vibration, you felt it, making even modest power feel like a wild ride. Like all true motorheads, drivers had more mechanical sympathy. They knew their cars inside out, could feel when something was off, and knew how to coax the best performance out of their machines without the aid of computers. You choose when to shift, how to match revs, and that control lets you maximize what little horsepower you've got. It's engagement, mate. Pure mechanical connection. These early cars had engines that were, let's say, less roaring beast and more polite cough. We're talking engines that might give you 1 to 4 horsepower. Imagine trying to outrun a horse-drawn carriage with what's essentially a motorized wheelbarrow. People expected these machines to replace horses, but with horsepower in the single digits, they often fell short. You couldn't haul much, couldn't go fast, and reliability was a gamble. It was like showing up to a drag race with a scooter. By the turn of the century, with folks like Ford and Benz tweaking and tuning, those horses under the hood started to multiply, and boy, did the world change when they did. Engineers and tinkerers knew they had to soup up these engines. More cylinders, better fuel systems, and eventually the internal combustion engine started to live up to its potential. More cylinders usually mean more power, but it's not just a numbers game. Each cylinder is like a muscle. The more you have, the more you can flex. But it's how they work together that really pumps out the horses. Every cylinder goes through a cycle: intake, compression, power, and exhaust. More cylinders mean more power strokes per engine revolution. Imagine each cylinder firing off like pistons in a gun. More barrels, more bullets flying downrange. More cylinders typically mean larger total engine displacement, the total volume of all the cylinders. More space for air and fuel means bigger explosions, which translates to more force pushing down on the pistons, hence more torque and horsepower. With more cylinders, you've got more room to play with cam profiles, intake, and exhaust designs. Each cylinder can be tuned to breathe better, optimizing the air-fuel mix for combustion. Think of it as having more lungs. You can take in more air, burn more fuel, produce more power. The 1920s and 1930s saw these beasts start to emerge. Engineers got clever with forced induction. By cramming more air into the engine, They could burn more fuel, which equals more bang for your buck. The 1960s and 1970s was when horsepower started to really flex its muscles, and the streets became drag strips, the golden age. Cars like the Dodge Charger and Ford Mustang were pushing out 300 to 400 plus horsepower with massive V8s. The addition of fuel injection, goodbye, carburetors, hello precision. Fuel injection meant engines could be tuned to perfection, squeezing out every last drop of power from the fuel. Add in lightweight materials, better aerodynamics, and advanced engine management systems. It is no longer just about brute force, it was about efficiency and torque. Modern horsepower has left the barn. It's not about how many horses you can replace, but how much power your engine or motor can produce. Horsepower is now a standardized unit of power, but we're not measuring it by watching horses anymore. Instead, it's all about dynamometers, which measure torque, and then some math magic happens to convert torque to horsepower. Today, horsepower is defined by the formula. Horsepower equals torque times RPM 5252, where torque is in pound-feet and RPM is the engine speed. Electric motors are great generators of torque. The greater the torque, the greater the initial acceleration. Manufacturers are looking for new ways to combine electric motors with traditional engines. These guys are not looking to save the planet, but using hybrid technology to achieve performance figures unmatched by traditional engines. From a time when horsepower literally meant how many horses you could outwork, we've galloped into an era where horsepower symbolizes the peak of engine performance, efficiency, and engineering prowess. It's evolved from a marketing term for steam engines to a universal benchmark for power in everything, from your daily driver to hypercars tearing up the track. But no matter how you slice it, more horsepower still means one thing in the world of gearheads: more fun, more speed, and more freedom on the open road.